Well, hello and welcome to this webinar on carbon capture and storage in the circular carbon economy, policy and regulatory recommendations. My name is Alex Apantis and I'm the General Manager Commercial at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and I'll be the MC for today's event. The work we're about to hear about is part of a broader research program into the opportunities and limits associated with the transition toward a more sustainable global economy that addresses climate change. The framework for this research is the circular carbon economy, which describes an holistic approach to climate mitigation where every option is utilised to deliver emissions abatement at the lowest overall cost and risk. This work is being delivered through a partnership between the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute and the Centre on Global Clean Energy Policy at Columbia University in the USA. You can find reports published as part of this series at the website circularcarboneconomy.co/resources. And that link we'll put in the Q&A panel or the chat panel of this webinar. We're very fortunate to be joined by three excellent speakers who are very well qualified to provide informed perspectives on climate change and carbon capture and storage. Those speakers are Dr. Julio Friedman, a senior research scholar at the Centre on Global Clean Energy Policy at Columbia University, Mr. Ian Havercroft, Principal Consultant, Policy, Legal and Regulatory at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and Dominic Russell, Senior Consultant, Finance, also at the Institute. Dr. Friedman will make some opening remarks to set the context for today's presentation, and then Ian and Dominic will present the report on policy and regulatory recommendations. Following this, we have some time for questions and a discussion. So please record your questions in the Q&A panel that you'll find at the bottom of the screen, and I will get to as many of them as I can at the end. Okay, our first speaker today is Dr. Julio Friedman, one of the world's most highly respected academics and commentators on climate mitigation. Julio is a senior research scholar at the Centre on Global Clean Energy Policy at Columbia University, where he leads a new initiative on carbon management. Recently, he served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fossil Energy at the US Department of Energy, where he was responsible for DOE's research and development program in advanced fossil energy systems, carbon capture and storage, and carbon dioxide utilisation. He's also held positions at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, including Senior Advisor for Energy Innovation and Chief Energy Technologist. Julio has Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees from MIT and a PhD in Geology from the University of Southern California. So over to you, Julio, for some opening remarks to set the context. You have up to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Alex. It is just a delight to be here, and thank you to the Center. Thank you to the Global Institute for having me. I'm delighted to be providing some comments around this extraordinary work, which we'll be hearing about in just a couple of minutes. I'm pleased to say that we are entering a new age of policy and regulation with respect to carbon capture and storage. We are seeing new policies coming up around the world, and we're seeing the regulatory frameworks for them mature. Perhaps there is no greater example of this than where I sit today in the United States. We are really seeing an alignment with infrastructure and markets and regulation regarding the policies of carbon capture and storage. An excellent example of this is the Senate infrastructure bill, which was actually moved to the Senate floor vote. There will be a full vote shortly on the bill. It includes a number of market aligning policies to help finance projects. These include $8 billion proposed for hydrogen hubs, $3.5 billion for direct air capture hubs, the SCALE Act, which helps finance and provide debt support for pipelines, $500 million a year for 4 years to help site characterization for interested parties, and importantly to the EPA, $50 million of support for permitting of CO2 disposal wells. There's a companion bill, which is the Reconciliation Budget Bill, that has another set of market lining incentives in them. Proposals include an expansion and enhancement of 45Q. The Catch Act, for example, would raise saline formation storage payments from $50 a ton today to $85 a ton. Quite a substantial increase and large enough to bring a whole new set of potential projects into the mix. One other proposal for 45Q is, instead of doing the current non-refundable tax credit, is to set up a direct pay option, which would not only incrementally increase the value of the credit, but allow many more parties to take part, because they would not require sufficient tax appetite. They can just go straight in. There's also a production tax credit for hydrogen, green hydrogen, and blue hydrogen, which is fossil with CCS, and a technology neutral tax credit called ESIC, in which would support carbon capture as a function of tonnage within the total system and provide both investment tax credit and production tax credit. All of these policies are really CCS specific and would create value and revenues for people trying to create projects and store CO2. Many of these provisions are actually well aligned with the administration's positions. Many of these points are called out in the American Jobs Plan that President Biden and his team released earlier this year. They are also consistent with the Justice 40 guidelines. And this is an important new component of the policy discussion. Justice 40 requires that 40% of the money be spent to remediate and improve the lot of disadvantaged communities. And here, because carbon capture can and does reduce criteria pollutants locally, some of the funding that we just discussed can fall under the Justice 40 framework. The guidelines for that just came out last week, and you can see them at the White House website. The US is not the only country doing this, let's be clear. Canada has infrastructure build-out coincident with things like the trunk line and other projects. They are exploring a clean fuel standard, which would provide funding for projects of various kinds. The Supreme Court in Canada has increased the carbon tax to $170 a ton by 2030. That is not a CCS specific policy, but is a large enough economic wide policy to create strong support. And of course, they have a hydrogen roadmap, which includes blue hydrogen and carbon capture. The United States program and the Canadian program mention hubs specifically, and we are starting to see hubs emerge as a specific topic. No place is a better example of that than in the UK, where not only CCS is laid out as a specific sector for support in the 10-point plan, but there is the billion-pound hub competition and a contract for difference mechanism, which allows strong financial support for CCS. Coincident with that is a recent discussion within BEIS that frames carbon capture as a best available technology, essentially a regulatory control that is, again, specific regulation that will help align markets and attract interest. That is being signaled across the EU as well. There's more money going into the Innovation Fund, which supports infrastructure and projects for CCS. There's a build out of hydrogen infrastructure, which is a market adjacent policy for CCS. Strengthening of fuel standards, and of course, a restructuring of the ETS, the emissions trading scheme, all of which will lead to better pricing and controls that would broadly support CCS. Specific nations in Europe are doing something similar. Germany, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and Italy are all looking at CCS-specific policies and have created either dedicated funds or dedicated pathways or dedicated financing incentives to help support CCS. All of this recognizes how important CCS will be to achieve net zero, particularly in industrial sectors. That said, there are a few things that are now new and perennial that come with this new policy advancement. One of them is an increasing focus on communities. I'd mentioned the Justice 40 program earlier. As we are seeing these projects roll forward, we are seeing project developers and governments, local, federal, and international, focus on the communities in and around projects. Anybody developing projects with these market aligning policies should expect that they need to prepare accordingly and seriously engage with communities so that they make sure that the greatest number of needs are met. This is not a box checking exercises. People must take the policy alignment associated with community benefit very seriously. The money will come from all of this. However, we have a shortfall of human capital. There are not enough people in the mix right now to deliver many of these projects and policies. So we will need to improve that for sure. One thing that can be done within governments is to start on standards for the carbon accounting. This will not only enable internal national, but also international activities of various kinds. For example, supporting a club of nation approach within a specific sector. CCS can have a strong role in such a thing. Alternatively, standards can help support a border carbon adjustment, which is now a policy provision that is floated within both the United States and Europe. A border carbon adjustment could align markets, or it could stifle markets. So getting the standards correct and making sure that CCS projects serve communities will help with the commodity trading associated with such things. Buckle up, folks. It's going to be a dynamic few years, and as the policy emerges, we will hopefully see more projects and better projects hitting the field as a consequence. With that, I turn it back to Alex. It's been a treat to share these thoughts.
Well, thanks very much, Julio, for those very insightful comments. I'm sure that all of us who are concerned about mitigating climate change will be very encouraged by the significant ramp up in policy to drive investment in CCS that you just described. But as you noted, there's still much to do, particularly around standards, for example. A reminder to those who are listening today that we will take questions at the end of the session. So please enter any questions that you might have in the Q&A panel in the Zoom window. Okay, now to the report that we have just published. This work will be jointly presented by two of my colleagues from the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. Our first speaker is Ian Havercroft. Ian is the Principal Consultant, Policy, Legal and Regulatory at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. Ian's a lawyer and a former academic specialising in environmental, climate and energy law. He has over 12 years experience working on CCS legal and regulatory issues, and he's published widely on those topics. Ian will immediately hand over to Dominic Rasool. Dominic is a senior consultant finance at the Institute. Dominic has experience developing low carbon projects in high risk environments, primarily with the United Nations Development Programme, where he has experience working in developing countries, including from the Middle East and North Africa region. Once again, please put any comments you might have, questions you might have in the Q&A panel. Ian and Dominic, over to you. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Alex. I think my camera's now working. I'm going to start by setting the scene and providing some context to our analysis and recommendations in the first couple of minutes. At the heart of this study, and as you can see on the first slide here, was the recognition that carbon capture and storage is an essential technology. Achieving the rapid reductions in emissions at the necessary scale will require action in every sector and country. And a broad portfolio of approaches and technologies will be required if we're to meet this challenge. If we consider the IPCC's analysis and the scenarios it considered in its pathway to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, the significance of the role of the significance that the role CCS must play becomes particularly apparent. And as we've highlighted on the second point within this slide, if we look at CCS in the year 2050 across all scenarios, we're looking at an average mass of CO2 stored of 10 gigatons. But essentially, the greater the climate target, the sooner the commitment to net zero is to be achieved, the larger the contribution of CCS will play in emissions abatement. Next slide, please. The versatility of CCS is a further important consideration and something we've also highlighted in the early stages of the report. Not a singular technology. CCS, as many of you will be aware, describes a family of technologies that may be applied to significant point sources, for example, to capture, transport, and subsequently store CO2. In this figure, we've demonstrated or highlighted the world's commercial CCS facilities that are operating in construction or in the advanced stages of development. And here we can really demonstrate CCS's versatility and the number of different industries where CCS is to be applied. And this is something that becomes more apparent as we look out to 2025 to the right-hand side of this diagram. Next slide, please. Focusing on the versatility of CCS, again, we've highlighted in this slide global emissions that have been attributed to different sectors. And we've highlighted in particular those emissions coming from industrial processes, including pulp and paper, cement, and aluminium, iron and steel, for example. The role of CCS in this sector is particularly significant, and in many instances, that is the only mitigation option. Is capture and permanent storage of CO2 emissions from these processes. Without mitigation, annual CO2 emissions from the industrial sector are anticipated to reach some 10 billion tons by 2060. CCS will be one essential option for mitigating these emissions. If we consider the cement or iron and steel or indeed chemical sectors, which currently account for roughly 70% of direct emissions from the industrial sector, it's clear that CCS will play a very significant role in mitigating their emissions. Now, on the basis of this context, to realize this potential and ambition that's being spelt out for the technology going forward, this study is focused upon the policy and regulatory environment that will be necessary for deployment. And I'm now going to hand over to Dominic, who's going to talk a little about the finance and investment sectors. Dominic.
Thank you, Ian. So over to the next slide, please. As Ian has highlighted, there's going to be, well, there is already a very high need for CCS across the different pathways, whereupon on average we have to sequester around 10 gigatons of CO2 across the distribution of these. And this equates to a high capital requirement that governments are either unwilling or unable to provide in the time frame required. And at the same time, however, we have trillions of dollars locked up in the private sector. So the solution seems quite simple, which is to unlock private capital and to apply that to CCS investments. The next slide, please. And in our report, we discuss the different market failures and barriers to investment that of CCS. And in this figure on the far right, you see what we describe as hard to reduce risks, which are those that we believe governments are best placed to manage and to allocate to the parties that are best suited to bear these risks. These are the policy and revenue risk, the cross-chain risk, and the long-term storage liability risk. The policy and revenue risk relates to an insufficient value being placed on CO2 in the sector where it is to be applied. The cross-chain risk emerges from the interdependency that exists across the CCS supply chain, which is that if one of the operators becomes unavailable, the whole supply chain suffers, and that poses an important risk to investment. The long-term storage liability risk is that which effectively businesses in the private sector will find it very challenging to bear the liability of leakage long after the operations have ceased. So a legal and regulatory framework is necessary to transfer that liability away from the private sector post-closure. Over to the next slide, please. In this figure here, we see the different project characteristics and enabling policies that have supported CCS projects around the world. And with financing in mind, I'd like to bring your attention to three key trends. Well, first of all, actually, what we can see is that if there is an enabling environment, the private sector will invest in CCS. So that we know. But the three key trends show us that across the fleet of operational CCS facilities, most of the investments have occurred in low-cost capture opportunities, such as natural gas processing, which represents effectively a low-hanging fruit for investments. And also what we see is that CO2 EOR has been playing an important role in generating the revenue for CCS projects. So it suggests that in the absence of EOR, some of these projects may not have occurred. This suggests then that the policy and revenue risk is indeed a very important risk. And finally, and most importantly for financing, once we have an enabling environment, we still see that most CCS facilities have been developed on the books of large corporations or state-owned enterprises. Over to the next slide, please. And so, of course, going back to these trends, to meet the climate targets, as Ian was suggesting, CCS needs to occur across a broad range of applications, not just low-cost capture opportunities. And the sale of CO2 for EOR, or more broadly for commercial reasons, doesn't scale with the requirement that we need for CCS, and it's logistically challenging. The climate policy is best suited to solve that problem. And of course, most companies don't have the balance sheets and the flexibility of large corporations and state-owned enterprises. So non-recourse debt or project finance is essential if CCS investments is to broaden out into smaller emitters. And over to the next slide, please. So this is just about project finance, which we touch on in the report, as we believe it's an important model for funding CCS projects. And effectively, project finance means financing based only on the future cash flows of a project. And as such, the financiers do not have recourse to the assets of the project owners. And so the project investing in a project finance project does not affect their credibility. But at the same time, lenders and investors are also exposed to all of the uncertainties of that project, which raises the cost of capital, including debt. But it also allows for multiple equity investors to share these risks together in a common investment. So we believe there that governments have a role to play in enabling project finance by mandating that specialist financiers, such as export credit agencies, development banks, and policy banks, such as in the UK, we have the UK Infrastructure Bank that was recently initiated to support project finance investments and therefore leverage the private sector by partnering up with them and by funding the most high-risk components of projects so that the private sector can come in with commercial debt. And over to the next slide. It's important to note that since 2017, many other financial institutions around the world representing around $17 trillion have pledged to become climate aligned. So that's the driver for investment from commercial banks, as they are invested already in assets that are exposed to what would be transition risks. And therefore, with CCS, they can overcome these risks. And so they have a vested interest in being able to invest in CCS. And so just the figure here showing you that climate alignment means reducing their portfolio emissions and becoming more aligned with the Paris Agreement. And with that, I'll pass back over to Ian.
Thank you, Dom. Next slide, please. Next slide again, please. The role of law and regulation has been something that's been highlighted for a long time. And indeed, Dr. Friedman touched upon this in his introductory comments. In many of the early reviews of the potential for carbon capture and storage dating back a number of years now, for example, the special report produced by the IPCC on CCS, law and regulation, or indeed the absence of law and regulation in many jurisdictions, was highlighted as a particularly critical issue and one which was frustrating deployment in many jurisdictions. I've highlighted 3 points on this slide as to why we've seen law and regulation as particularly critical for CCS deployment. The first is that it provides a formal recognition of far wider national, regional, and international policy commitments to the technology. And we see those particularly at the national level in countries, NDCs, for example, or indeed more broadly within the international climate change agreements. Law and regulation has also played a particularly critical role in ensuring the legality of operations under existing national or regional laws, but also at the international level and removing barriers to the technology's deployment. And we've seen that, for example, in the London Protocol. And beyond this, it also plays a very important role in promoting confidence in the technology, as Dominic was just talking about in relation to investment and financing of the technology. A detailed legal and regulatory regime provides some form of certainty for investors that the technology will be regulated efficiently, and also for the broader public that there is security in the regulatory model. Next slide, please. Over the past 10 to 15 years, we have seen the development of what I'm terming CCS-specific legislation, that is legislation dedicated to the regulation of the technology. And we've seen a number of pieces of legislation developed in jurisdictions around the world. In Europe, we've had the EU Storage Directive, which has been implemented by the European member states. CCS-specific legislation in the United States at the federal level, and indeed in many of the states. In Canada at the provincial level. Here in Asia and Australia, we've had legislation in Japan, and in Australia we have both Commonwealth and state level regulatory frameworks aimed at addressing the regulation of the CCS process. Within all of these different regulatory frameworks, and we've described this in a little bit more detail in the report, there's been a range of approaches that have been adopted in how these frameworks have been developed. While there are clear variations between each of the various regulatory models, I think we can identify some common themes. And I've highlighted these in the sub-bullet points in this second issue here. The first is the removal of barriers and the provision of incentives. And we can see that within, for example, the European legislation, which removes barriers to waste, removes barriers to that are found within existing waste legislation, water legislation for carbon capture and storage. One of the interesting things that we noted is that during the development of many of these early regulatory regimes, it was also the first time that we saw a lot of early projects starting to be discussed. And we saw a very close relationship between project proponents, regulators, and policymakers in the design of these regulatory frameworks. And we see that many of them take a somewhat benevolent approach towards the regulation of the CCS process and address many of those early concerns that we saw expressed by project proponents. Another factor is that we've also seen the reconciliation of a range of broader objectives within national and indeed regional legal and regulatory frameworks, particularly those in relation to energy, climate, and the environment. Beyond this, there have been some very important aspects which have been addressed in these early regimes. And I've just highlighted three issues here, which seem to be particularly common to the regulatory frameworks developed to date. The first is a life cycle approach to permitting, one which requires the permitting and regulation of discrete phases of the CCS project, both from its conception right the way through to closure, and indeed in some instances into the post-closure phase. We've seen the development of detailed monitoring and verification obligations, in many instances intrinsically linked to some crediting schemes, for example. And we've also seen very difficult issues such as long-term liability and the post-closure phase addressed. Next slide, please. However, and we've highlighted again in the report, there remain a number of legal and regulatory challenges, and indeed challenges which are to be faced by those jurisdictions which have yet to develop their legal and regulatory frameworks. The first is the need to ensure that law and regulation supports all technologies and pathways. Many of the early frameworks that were designed had a very different concept of carbon capture and storage from from the technology that's being deployed around the world to date. As such, we've seen specific elements of the technology excluded or preferred within regulatory regimes, and we're starting to see regulators and policymakers address these gaps or unwitting obstacles. The impact of legislation upon broader public policy, or the relationship between the two, is actually quite important as well. And we've seen significant uptake in CCS, for example, where we've seen very strong policy commitments reflected in detailed regulatory frameworks. And then the final point I'll highlight here are the timeframes associated with the development of law and regulation, and the fact that these need not be underestimated. For many of the legal and regulatory regimes that are in place, we're still seeing further refinements and pieces missing within the broader jigsaw of those those regimes and are still yet to be addressed. For those jurisdictions which have yet to develop legislation, the time frame associated with developing a regulatory framework is a really critical factor to consider. Next slide, please. I'll now hand back to Dom, and we'll cover our recommendations from the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And so, yeah, the first few points of our recommendations. Well, the first is that obviously it's important to define the role of CCS and the role it may play in meeting national emission reductions targets. So, for example, that can be an explicit target on how much CO2 the government believes must be sequestered, or something a little bit more implicit, which is perhaps a target for example, hydrogen production, clean hydrogen production, which we know blue hydrogen is to play a significant role in. And this then provides a strong signal for the private sector to know that they can move into a certain space and make the most of an opportunity. Secondly, to provide certain long-term and high value on the storage of CO2 through climate-based policies. And this is, of course, obviously important if the private sector is going to invest, because they will need to be able to pay back any debts that they have, to cover the costs in addition to that for transportation and storage if they're connected to a hub, for example, and of course, finally, to generate a return on their capital investment. The third point is greater investment in the identification and appraisal of geological storage resources, because that helps with project planning. It helps emitters know if they're near a hub or, near a storage asset, and that maybe a hub can come about because of this. And it also helps with that signal I'd mentioned earlier. And finally, address the key challenges of financing and investing in CCS. And this goes back mostly to project financing that I talked about earlier, given that many organizations are going to need non-recourse debt. It will be up to government to provide the concessions for financing where they believe, or the private sector especially believes, concessions will be necessary, where debt simply cannot be applied because of certain risks that banks, for example, would be unwilling to finance through commercial debt. Or it could be impact financing for the same reasons as well, but where the private sector would be keen to invest, but the debt is simply unavailable, for example, in a particular region of the world where debt is just generally very expensive for what is perceived to be high risk. And with that, I'll pass over to Ian for the remaining recommendations. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Dom. Next slide, please. The final three recommendations, the first of which is to place a strong emphasis upon the development of CCS-specific legal and regulatory regimes, and notably those which truly address the challenges of deployment. Firstly, removing any remaining barriers to the technology that may be found in regimes globally. Secondly, to adopt a full life cycle approach, perhaps, to regulation, one that looks at the operation of a CCS project from its, as I said earlier, its original conception right through and planning stages right through to closure and potentially the post-closure phase. Importantly, regulation that addresses the CCS specific challenges and address issues such as pore space access, monitoring and verification, for example, site selection, and indeed the perennial issue of liability. Secondly, we need to ensure that policy and regulatory mechanisms support all emissions abatement options. Unintentional or indeed deliberate exclusion of abatement options will ultimately prevent the selection where a technology may in fact be the best option, which is likely to result in increased costs of abatement. And then finally, and an issue that Dr. Friedman highlighted in his opening remarks, is the need to identify and perhaps promote opportunities for the development of CCS hubs. We highlight in the report a number of beneficial factors associated with hubs, not least their reduction of costs through economies of scale, their potential to reduce cross-chain or counterparty risks, for example, as well as the potential to support job creation and national climate action. But some of the potential here is to act as the first investor in CO2 transport and storage infrastructure in the promotion of hubs, or indeed reduce the legal and regulatory hurdles that are found in promoting hubs to enable multi-user access, for example. Next slide, please. I'll end by thanking you, but also highlighting the link to the report, and I will hand over to Alex. Thank you, Alex.
Well, thanks very much, Dominic and Ian, for that presentation. Quite a difficult task to present what is quite a detailed report in only 20 minutes. So I do encourage everyone to go to the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute website and download it, or you can download it from the website we've set up specifically to receive this work, which is circularcarboneconomy.co/resources. Okay, now to some questions. So first question I think we'll put to Julio, since he was the first speaker, and it relates to environmental justice, which has become quite a significant driver of thinking and policy in the United States. How is that impacting the debate on carbon capture and storage? And how do hubs, which you mentioned quite specifically in your opening remarks, help to address the issues of equity and justice?
Happy to talk about this. It's a very important topic and one that's growing in importance, especially in the United States. The concept of environmental justice is pretty straightforward. Dr. Bob Bullard at Texas State University describes it simply as applying all the laws equally. And that's a pretty straightforward way to think about it. In many cases, communities have not really had the opportunity to do so. The laws have not been applied equally. In many cases, disadvantaged communities have not had agency or access to make sure that they get benefits associated with these things. So first and foremost is just this kind of framing. Make sure that the benefits of carbon capture are manifested in the communities where a project would be. In order to do that, you really need to engage communities early on. We have seen projects founder because the outreach to the community was done poorly or not at all. The Baden-Direct project in Germany is one example that's pretty famous. There are others. Youngstown, Ohio was one where that did not go well. Simply, you need to provide conversations and context to engage. It is possible the community still may not accept the project. If that's the case, then you have a substantial challenge as a developer. But you can't be cavalier about these things. If we're going to have an energy transition that is just leading to a verdant world, we simply must engage the communities and make sure that the benefits of carbon capture are manifested there as well as globally.
Okay, thanks, Julio. Ian and Dominic, if I can ask you to turn on your cameras and unmute yourselves, because the next question I think I'll put to both of you, and it relates to the EU. And the question is, how progressive is the European Union in comparison to other parts of the world regarding policy and regulatory foundations? So perhaps, Ian, if you could make some comments about regulation, and Dominic, if you could make some comments about policy. Once again, comparison EU versus the rest of the world.
Thanks. I can point from a regulatory perspective to one of the products that the Institute produces, which is the Legal and Regulatory Indicator. And here we've undertaken assessment of 55 jurisdictions around the world, including all of the EU member states. Within that assessment, most of the European member states sort of fall within the middle ground. There's a number of notable standouts there: the UK, the Netherlands, Denmark, which have very, very detailed legal and regulatory frameworks that build upon the EU Storage Directive that I mentioned earlier. The other member states have all implemented the Storage Directive, but in many instances, they have, as far as we've assessed it, implemented almost the minimum requirements and haven't gone beyond. There has really been no incentive for them to do that until we have projects coming online. And we're starting to see a number of regulators in Europe starting to consider how they can strengthen or improve their regulatory frameworks. How do they stand in comparison to other jurisdictions around the world? I think they're still at a relatively advanced stage, particularly when you compare the regulatory frameworks in Europe to perhaps Southeast Asia or the Asia Pacific region. The obviously exclusion there would be Australia. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Dom, I'll hand over to you.
And Dom, you're muted.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Ian. Yeah, so the EU has the EU ETS, which is what creates the value on CO2 most generally across all of the jurisdictions of its member states. But that perhaps is not sufficient in terms of driving investments across all of the sectors where CCS is needed. So on top of the EU ETS, its member countries have to develop additional policies to support investments. So for example, we see the SDE++ in the Netherlands, which of course, notwithstanding supporting other low carbon technologies, also supports CCS. And that is what has been necessary there, as well as the Porthos project, which is a shared transport and storage infrastructure project. But at the same time in Porthos, we see capital support from the EU coming in to help fund that pipeline. So it's sort of EU as a whole is doing something, which is good. Is it doing enough? Perhaps not quite, but we see countries reacting to that depending on each of their individual targets. How does this compare to the rest of the world? Maybe sort of the middle ground, again, like Ian was suggesting for legal and regulatory, because of course the EU is ahead of many other countries that need CCS, but it's not the one that's in the lead. I would say that the UK and the US are probably further ahead, or North America more generally, than the EU.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is an interesting question. Someone made the point that one of our recommendations about all technologies being assisted by policy or supported by policy being important. Made the observation that that's actually a really important recommendation, but then asked the question about carbon mineralization. So all of the policies that do support and drive CCS are focused on geological storage of carbon dioxide. Carbon mineralization generally is absent from most policies. So I'd like to get your reactions to that. Perhaps Julio first, and then Ian and Dom.
Sure, it's a fair point. It also depends on the kind of mineralization. The sort of geological storage that's being done in Iceland, for example, mineralizing there would qualify under most regulations. But surface or ex-situ mineralization would not. And one good example of this is the low carbon fuel standard in California. It directly lays out a provision for direct air capture. It has a whole CCS protocol that is in place, but it does not include mineralization. Other kinds of storage like biomass carbon removal systems like the kind done by Charm Industrial would not qualify, for example. So I think there needs to be some work done to amend existing statutes to have a slightly wider aperture. The focus here has to be on monitoring and verification, on tonnage, on valid, durable storage. As long as the mechanism supports those things, then it's worth broadening the aperture of these policies for greater inclusion.
Thanks, Julio. Ian, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Julio has just touched on the two examples I was going to look at that mentioned the LCFS. But I will say, I think one of the, I don't necessarily see this as something that's deliberate. I think it's more a function of the time when the legislation was first drafted. Certainly, we didn't anticipate either the interest or the scale and magnitude of technologies such as mineralization playing such a significant role. And the focus was entirely upon CCS, or geological storage, in the I'll say the original sense. Expansion of that definition, I think, will be really critical, and to address some of the factors that Julio mentioned there, not least the issue of permanence.
Right. And one of the nice things is that we continue to be creative and come up with new ideas. This company, Running Tide, that is sinking negatively buoyant kelp in the mid-Atlantic is one example. ideas for ocean alkalinity enhancement or others. I'm delighted that we are able to innovate in this space, but the policies often lag behind the innovators, and we just need to continue to be open and active in expanding that framework.
Excellent point. Dom, did you have anything to add on that question?
I think the two gentlemen have covered all the bases there, Alex, but perhaps just to try to build a little bit on there, I think we have to be also mindful of where we are. I think as Ian was touching upon in the sort of the trajectory of development of CCS, and mineralization inevitably we expect will become more and more relevant. But right now it's a question of catching the low-hanging fruit, which is just storage on its own. Perhaps to include mineralization, and just to add on to what Julio was saying, I think it's methodologies as well that are important. We could say the same for CCS versus low carbon technologies in CCS would have been perfectly suitable at some point if the price was right, but the methodology wasn't there. So it's a question of developing the methodologies and proving that to policymakers.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. There's lots of questions coming in now. Here's an interesting one. What role do you think a carbon take-back obligation could play as a specific regulatory tool to push carbon dioxide storage? So the concept here obviously is if you export a fossil fuel, you have some sort of obligation to take back some of the CO2 that would otherwise be released through the utilization of those fossil fuel resources. Who would like to offer a view on that?
My general position would be that it depends on how the take-back obligation is structured. Fundamentally, it moves the cost to the ratepayers. So if an oil company, for example, had a take-back obligation, it would show up in the price of their product. It would have to be broadly established, but they would have CCS as an option in order to manage that, assuming it was set up correctly. It would also, of course, depend on the specifics of how it's implemented. But directionally, it should, let me try to say this the best way I can. If it's done carefully and well, a take-back obligation could be a way to create a permanent business model for CCS, which would be a rather interesting idea.
Ian, Dom, any comments on that, or do you think Julio's covered that one?
I agree with Julio, Alex.
No, I do too. I second that.
Okay, let's keep moving. Thanks for that, Julio. Excellent comments there. So someone's observed that to enable scale, cross-chain collaboration is needed to facilitate project capture, transport, and storage to share the costs, risks, and expertise. Dom, would you like to comment on that observation?
Yeah, sure. I think as I touched upon, I was calling it the cross-chain risk. Yeah, that's absolutely necessary. And we've been seeing this in the UK playing a large role, also in the Netherlands, the Alberta trunk line in the US as well. And the reason why this is important is because, as I'd said previously, it de-risks the investment from all parties. And at the same time, by regulating the tariff that is going to be applied and paid for by the capture facility, it's easier for capture investors to plan for their projects and to secure debt financing based on this, and in conjunction with the enabling policy that places a value on CO2. The initial investment, however, in hubs in the clusters, in the shared transport and storage network, will probably have to receive support from government, because you have to oversize that pipeline, and the private sector that's going to be regulated in their tariff will not be able to price that high. So as long as there's government support, it probably will work, and there will have to be government support because we need it for CCS to work. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. One participant has asked about the Nimby effect. So Nimby stands for not in my backyard. The questioner observes that a CCS project has been cancelled because of community concern in the Netherlands, and asks whether any of you think that community sentiment could be a showstopper in future CCS projects. So I'd be interested in your views on how you've seen community sentiment move and whether you think it remains a significant threat to CCS projects, particularly with onshore storage. Julio, you want to go first?
Sure. In the Netherlands, there's just no chance that you're going to do an onshore project, period. It's not just NIMBYism, there's other issues that are associated with that. In general, I think we are going to see most European projects develop in the offshore. There may be a couple of projects, possibly in Italy, for example, which are near shore or onshore that trend offshore. But generally speaking, one of the benefits of moving to offshore geological storage is it sidesteps this NIMBY question. I believe we will ultimately see quite a lot of that in the United States, in particular in the Gulf of Mexico. There it's for a somewhat different reason. NIMBYism matters, community justice and equity matters, but really the issue is poor volume access. Right now, the only way to access a lot of the poor volume in the US is to aggregate under one landowner. And you go to the offshore, the landowner is either the state or the nation. And that makes it straightforward in terms of getting access to the poor volume. NIMBYism is certainly an issue, though, and one where, again, as I'd said earlier, early and real and persistent and sustained community engagement is essential.
Thanks, Julio. Ian, you've been around this space for a long time and you've done quite a bit of work on ESG. Now, that's a bit tangential to NIMBY, but have you gleaned any learnings from your work more generally on how community sentiment can impact on CCS projects and how you think that community sentiment might be changing over time?
Yes, I'll make 2 points in relation to that. I think the first around community sentiment is more broadly is pretty important when it comes to the environment and climate change. If you look at the increased volume of climate litigation that's being undertaken around the world, I mean, the United States is very much the leader in cases being brought, but we're seeing Australia and Europe as a particularly fertile ground for climate litigation. It's not too dissimilar from environmental action that's taken against other major infrastructure activities where there's, risks of pollution that have been brought previously. I mean, if you look at, applications to oppose things like waste incineration plants, for example, early nuclear plants, that litigation has been particularly effective. And I think the CCS community as a whole would be remiss of them not to look at the lessons of the past. Particularly around environmental activism. We're seeing the true effect of climate litigation now for many major infrastructure projects around the world. And an example here would be some of the coal developments here in Australia. We originally thought that litigation would be dismissed, but there has been some very real effects felt here in Australia around some major projects. Julio's point around timely engagement and the need to focus on engagement is really very, very significant. And there are some very good examples as well as how this has been managed. I point to perhaps the work that was done in Japan around the Tomokamai project, where we had an incredibly successful example of very, very carefully thought out, detailed community engagement that resulted in fact, broad support for the project amongst a broad range of demographics in the local community.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Ian. Right, many questions coming in now. Question for you, Dominic. There's a question about how grant funding should be utilised. I wonder if you could spend a little bit of time telling us the smartest ways of applying grant funding, particularly given your previous experience in the UNDP.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. That's a good question. From the outset, the purpose of grant funding generally is ultimately to enable investments from the private sector. So at the beginning, maybe grant funding is all that's utilized to support projects. And that's because the project is perceived as high risk. It's the first of a kind project, and banks would be unwilling to invest debt money in there, and equity is maybe difficult to raise from the private sector as well. As projects become de-risked, there's lessons that are learned on how to better understand the performance risks of projects, for example, and understanding construction. Maybe the capital injection of grant funding in projects can diminish relative to what's private. And that then we enter the stage of where it begins to leverage private investment. Over time, a more refined approach can be used. So the grant funding can be used specifically to the remaining sort of residual risks in projects. In CCS particularly, we look at the very early stages of development when drilling and assessing sort of storage resources are being considered. That's oftentimes a sunk cost if, for example, we don't get the answer that we want. And so by using grant funding for that component of projects, then the remaining private capital can be used for what eventually leads to a return on the investment, hopefully. Grant funding later on can also be used as in different instruments, such as loan guarantees that we've seen in the US, where then that directly leverages commercial lending from banks. And I think that's generally it in a nutshell without going into too much detail. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So one sort of semi-technical question now, and I'll put this one to you, Julio, for a very quick answer. How does CCS address non-carbon dioxide emissions and criteria air pollutants?
Yeah, this is a very important topic, happy to discuss. In short, if you retrofit an existing facility, you will reduce pollution. You will reduce sulfur, nitrous oxides, particulates, mercury, volatile organic carbon. All of these are reduced when you retrofit an existing facility. That has been measured and is well known. That is, in fact, one of the important things to communicate with respect to questions of NIMBY or equity and justice, is that one of the benefits that a community could receive is the pollution reduction associated with the CCS itself. And that's because the systems that capture the carbon have very low pollution tolerances and sometimes scavenge the pollutants themselves.
Thank you for that very succinct answer. Also, Ian, we're looking for a quick answer to this one also from you. Does CO2 quality have to be verified before storage? Is there a related specification?
You tend to find, if I'm looking at Europe, for example, quite broad categorization. You find that in the international legislation as well. Purity standards are overwhelmingly is the term that's used in European legislation, must contain overwhelmingly of CO2. The only condition that's additional to that is it doesn't contain any waste matter, and it may contain tracing elements for the purposes of monitoring and verification. There has been suggestion that you could have a percentage, but obviously the risk around that is then it leaves a remaining percentage which could potentially be something other or less positive, should we say. So you don't tend to find purity standards per se, specifically in the legislation.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Now, this is a very good question. It goes to the amount of time taken to acquire a permit for storage. And I'll read part of this question now because it's quite well written. It says, there is a running joke in the US that the numerical value of well classes, i.e. 1, 2, 3 to 6, determines how many years it takes to get a permit. I worry that with such long time delays between identifying a good geology and actually getting CO2 into the ground, it is like having a house on fire and calling the fire department from another state. Do you see a way that we could streamline permitting for these projects without compromising due diligence? So is there a way to ensure that CO2 is being stored securely as required to satisfy regulators, whilst at the same time putting in place a more efficient, streamlined process? Any thoughts on that from anyone?
Well, since this is my backyard, I'll start the conversation. In short, yes, there are ways to do this. The most important way is to actually train the regulators and to staff up. And the infrastructure bill, which is moving to the Senate now, contains $50 million a year for that purpose. So that's a good thing to do. Another thing to do to shorten the timeline to permitting is to get a lot of the geological spade work done in advance. And in point of fact, the infrastructure bill puts $500 million forward a year for the next 4 years to do exactly that. So not only are there ways to do it, but they're being proposed and hopefully enacted soon. There is, of course, a process under which the well classes themselves are reviewed. In the case of class 6 wells, every 8 years, they undergo a review process. And so starting in about 2022, the EPA should be taking that on seriously. So it's not wrong to limber up and look for ways to think about streamlining and facilitating that sort of processing. It's a real problem, but like any other real problem, it has real solutions.
Thanks, Julio. Ian, Dom, any comments, perhaps more generally, about finding that right balance between the rigor of the approval process and the efficiency and time required to complete it?
Just quickly, looking and identifying regulatory pinch points where there's potentially overlap between different agencies or consultation required between, in common law jurisdictions, different ministers, for example, who have a responsibility for, say, water or waste in parallel to energy, trying to identify where there may be duplication of permitting obligations, where they may need certain sequencing of permits. All of those things could be addressed up front. It needs review, it needs a regulator to take a lead, and it needs better consultation between departments.
Just to add to what Ian had said, I think that helps to streamline or to fast track rather the development of projects, which only helps with financing. So giving sort of investors a very clear sort of outlook as to how much time it will take for them to secure a license and the nature of that license. I'm speaking more broadly beyond the US as well. That helps to de-risk, and that helps to make it easier to secure financing.
Okay, thanks. We are over time, but I'm going to ask one more question because I think it's a good one, and this question is to all three of our speakers. Assuming we are successful in deploying CCS in North America and Europe, how can we get China and India with lower cumulative emissions on board as well? This will be quite crucial.
So let me volunteer that a border carbon adjustment might not be the best way to do that. It's likely to create friction between nations, not partnerships. One of the important things that India needs is actually capacity building. They need improved geological assessments. They need training. That they have not undertaken a carbon capture and storage enterprise. That was something which we had begun in the Obama administration. Hopefully that is something which can be expanded or continued going forward. China is quite a different case. Here, really the question is, will NDRC treat this topic seriously? The most important actors in China are the state-owned oil companies, Sinopec, PetroChina, and CNOOC. In that, I'm pleased to see Sinopec starting to take carbon capture seriously. And under the leadership of their new CEO, Dong Yuzhou, they have begun to build and will hopefully commission it soon the Shunli project in Qilu, where they will be capturing CO2 from a hydrogen plant there and storing it. The state-owned companies there have the geological data. Nobody does beyond them. So they're really the only ones who can pull this off. So it's nice to see this kind of leadership.
Thanks, Julio. Dom, given your previous experience in developing climate mitigation projects in developing countries, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, maybe. I think looking at it very broadly, the reason why low carbon technologies tend to be more successful than CCS in developing countries, other than the obvious reason of cost and complexity, is because they provide a co-benefit, which very often is sort of cheap power, for example. CCS doesn't have that advantage. And in fact, CCS is a cost. So that's very challenging already for developing countries to take on a cost. But I think climate finance has an important role to play in supporting countries to meet their NDCs. And what we find with respect to India, for example, not having CCS explicitly written in its NDC makes it perhaps a bit more challenging to receive that support. But maybe that's also a question of capacity building and education. And in terms of drivers for the investment from the private sector, I know Julio said that a carbon border adjustment is not the best idea. But ultimately, if, for example, the markets where they export to several goods already have standards, we've seen in the past that developing countries that are exporting to those markets adhere to standards eventually. And if that's the cost of doing business, then so be it. I think they will meet those costs. But if there is supportive sort of financing and frameworks along the way, then it's possible. But of course, important discussions need to be had.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We have run out of time. In fact, we're over time. I'm getting messages here reminding me that we're over time. I'd like to thank Julio and Dominic and Ian for their insightful remarks and informative presentations. Thanks also to everyone who joined us today. We had 150 to 200 people watch this seminar this evening. Don't forget to look at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute's website or circularcarboneconomy.co/resources to download the report. It's quite a good report. We think we're proud of it, and we hope that you will learn something from it. All reports in this series, of course, will be published on that website. This series being produced jointly by the Global CCS Institute and the Center on Global and Clean Energy Policy at Columbia University. So if you need any further information on CCS, please visit the Global CCS Institute website, where you'll find literally hundreds of reports and other resources that are freely available to the public. And of course, if your organization is interested in joining the Global CCS Institute, we'd love to hear from you. This really is an exciting time for CCS, as you will see in our upcoming Global Status of CCS report, which will be released in a couple of months' time. Goodbye.